Level up your LA Kings experience with the new Vivid Seats Elite Seats. All the on-ice Kings action with even more exclusive access. Enjoy great seats to the game along with premier dining inside the Lexus Club with all-you-can-eat food and non-alcoholic beverages. Plus, get a free Team LA Kings item and parking with your purchase. Score your Vivid Seats Elite Seats tickets today and earn rewards on each purchase from the only ticket company that rewards you for buying. Experience it live with Vivid Seats, the official partner of the LA Kings.
You're listening to an LA Kings podcast. For more episodes of this and every other Kings program, visit lakings.com/podcast.
You're listening to All the Kings Men, the official podcast of the LA Kings. Now, here's your host, Jesse Cohen.
All right, we're doing our end-of-season player evaluations. Here to help me today, Jim Fox. How are you doing today, Jim?
Jesse, I'm doing very well. Thank you. Thanks for having me again.
Yeah, well, thanks for doing it. We don't have to spend a ton of time on it, but this is actually the first time you and I have spoken since the season ended. Any just, overarching, encompassing thoughts on the end of the season, the naming of Ken Holland as GM, summer,
Yeah. I mean, the end of the season is still extremely disappointing.
Mm-hmm.
There were some contributing factors, and some of those were Edmonton Oilers. And then there were some other ones that were, they stood out, were LA King, friendly fire, mistakes, moments that were not handled by the Kings. And again, if you look at numbers and metrics and things of that sort, there's an argument to be made. But that's if. It's only if. There's an argument to be made that they played well enough. But of course, in the moments that counted, they did not. And that's why it's extremely disappointing. I know there's different feelings out there, but different people. But I do believe that this team was the best team the Kings have had in a while. And I believe they were ready. And then when the moment came, they were not ready.
Yeah. Well, I think, yeah. I mean, that seems to be the consensus, and it's what I shared my feelings on Kings Talk and All the Kings Men, is that it just feels like an opportunity missed, and that is always harder than if Connor McDavid had come out and scored 9 points a game. Well, then you shrugged and you go, all right, well,
yeah,
what can you do? But when you feel like you had the ball on your racket, as they say, that's always a little bit harder to walk away from.
Yeah, the Kings were in control for large segments of the series, segments of games. And again, then the moments came in. I'm only stating the obvious. I'm only going over what people have probably gone over a million times, but the coach's challenge, that went the other way. And then later, again, I've mentioned it before, I think to you and others, there's a saying in sports, it's not how, it's how many. Just get to 4 wins. Just get to 4 wins. That doesn't matter how. I felt games 5 and 6 were directly related to games 3 and 4. And I think they were over. And I always think it was something that the Kings could not overcome. The emotional disappointments. Just again, challenge didn't go their way. 1 point, one moment. The non-clearing of the puck, another moment. The sitting back, regardless of whether it was strategy or just human nature, the usage of players that was different than the regular season, which is not unusual to be different than the regular season, but I think there was a couple of dramatic issues there. So those are all things that have been hashed over, talked about. But as I'm trying to answer your question, that's what is still sticking in my mind. There's a lot of positives there, because when you do think you had a chance to beat a team that went all the way to the 7th game of the Stanley Cup final last year and that are still on their way to perhaps another final this year, then you think you have a pretty good team. I mean, it's the one thing I think we all have to be careful of is to not throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Yeah.
And sure we don't overreact that way. You mentioned Ken Holland. I think, and I've mentioned it publicly, I think it's the only decision the Kings could make under the circumstances, taking into account the timeline the Kings feel they're on. They feel they're there. Obviously, they're not, but they feel the rate they're not. Ken Holland has Stanley Cup experience, and he's probably not. Ken, he's on the back nine of his career, but it fits, right? It fits his ability to come in with that type of gravitas to help a group that is trying to figure out that last step, and so that's where we are. I'm sure there were a lot of other people that younger and differing strengths, but I think to say I know Kenny Holland would be, I don't know him personally, but I've covered him and followed him for many, many, many years, and I think the Kings are in good hands.
It's funny. It just resume wise, if that's what you're basing it on, you're not going to find someone in the league with a better resume, currently employed or not, than Ken Holland. But let's use what you just said about time on ice to transition into doing the player evaluations, because today we're going to focus on Joel Edmundson, Jordan Spence, and Brandt Clarke. And when the season began, Joel Edmundson, I wasn't sure what to expect, Jim. But one thing that I did not expect was that he would set career highs in minutes played and games played. He played, if I'm not mistaken, more minutes than Anze Kopitar and Adrian Kempe on the season. That's not time on ice per game, but that's just total minutes. He played 1,300 minutes this season, and averaged. That's at even strength. Sorry, that's not even.
Yeah. Again, I know there are a lot of forwards that play, but when you're a defenseman, you usually play more than the forwards.
Yes, no, for sure, and I wouldn't be surprised.
He averaged more than Kopitar did. He averaged more than Kempe did. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
And I agree with you 100%. I think he was. My understanding of what he was able to bring was to be more complementary as a impact, and I don't think there's any question in my mind that he had a positive impact. I mean, he was a big part of a solid penalty kill that was pretty consistent all year long, and of course, when you finish second best in goals against average and you're known as a defensive defenseman, you're getting the job done. But right, I think he did play more. I think the concerns were as the season would go along, he would wear down. And, he did get injured there near the end of the regular season. But, I think that he exceeded, as you pointed out, he exceeded in those areas of ice time and just this usage, how he was used.
Yeah, we don't need to get into a whole debate about the use of plus minus or its value or whatever, but I mean his plus minus on the season was preposterous. Yeah. I mean, it was really good. I'm trying to find it right now. My website's not cooperating.
Plus 25.
I mean, it was insane.
And again, I looked again at the impact on a team. So you have the second best goals against average in the entire league, and you're a defensive defenseman. Your main priority is to keep the puck out, and then to play as many minutes as you did. So again, acquisition. We went over this near the end of the season. The acquisitions in the last year. Of course, Rob is no longer here, but in the last year, the acquisitions he made, he batted 1,000.
Yeah,
and there are a lot of discussions to be had about other decisions that were made previous to that, but. Joel Edmundson was one of those guys that came in and exceeded. I think, Rob would say differently maybe, and maybe Jim Hiller, because, they were probably part of the process to bring Joel here. But Jim Hiller mentioned he went all the way back to junior hockey when he coached against Joel. So, you kind of know people, but I would assume he exceeded their expectation too.
Yeah, and I don't know this for a fact, but if you had told me at the start of the season that he was going to set career highs for minutes played and games played, right, I probably would have assumed that he would have had more than 22 penalty minutes.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad. I mean, I'm assuming it's a good thing. You don't want a guy racking up a ton of penalty minutes. But for a full season, essentially, of play from a top 4D that was part of that penalty kill that you mentioned and played that role, to not put himself in the box, to not put himself doubly shorthanded, not just taking the penalty, but also removing himself from the penalty kill.
Right.
It's a pretty good job.
And he was another piece to that let's get a little bit tougher element that came through, during the season. I talked to other players on other teams, and that's the first thing they came up is he's an honest guy, right? He's not a run around, and he's just a stay at home, positionally, sound, real good shot. We found out as far as, getting the puck through and on net, not going to light it up by any means, but enough to, create something happening there a couple of times. But he did what he was supposed to do and more.
And this is neither here nor there, but I was struck at how much he fits into the sort of trope of the gentle giant, right? He's 6'5". He's known for his cross check. He's known to play that uncomfortable style. And yet in the locker room, every time we spoke to him, big smile, friendly demeanor, seems to have a real solid awareness of not only his role, but his career, but everybody else on the team, real, just full sense of expectations for him and the entire club, right? Like a smart hockey mind.
Yeah, I think I go back to the word honest. And when you're honest, then you don't have to have, you don't doubt yourself. You just know exactly who you are and you bring it. There's no skeletons in the closet anywhere. There's nothing to hide. He's a complete team player. He would never be accused of being selfish. So all of those, things do go together. And, it's really not hard to give him a grade this year. It really isn't.
Yeah.
Except, he exceeded expectations and more on a team that had a real good regular season, the best ever in franchise history. And then again, just to match up in the defensive areas, the numbers, we know the analytics, we know what's happened, even if you go deeper than the goals against average as a team, Joel was part of all of that for the Kings and how they suppressed shots and suppressed chances and made sure they approached the game that way.
Now, part of the ease that comes when it comes to grading a player like Joel Edmundson is because he was given the opportunity to play, that role and to be on the penalty kill and top four and get all these minutes and everything. The next two guys we're going to talk about, let's start with Spence, because there's a topic that comes up whenever I decide to gush about how much I like Jordan Spence, and I'm curious how much it matters to you personally. And that is the idea of strength of competition, because I saw one of those little player cards that they make, where they break everything down into red and blue numbers. And Jordan Spence's card was blue primarily across the board. The two areas that was red was strength of competition and quality of teammate, which just means he's a third pair defender. That's all. It doesn't mean, there's nothing out of his control. But given that his strength of competition was not as high as the other defenders in the Kings blue line core, how much do we ding him for that when we look at the fact that he's got exceptional numbers in, every statistical category you'd want? Like, yes, he's got these great numbers, but he's playing against third pair competition.
Correct. And that has to be taken into consideration. I mean, especially in a playoff series. I'm just going to go this way. You'll have some guys that get points and produce and then there's some other guys that don't. But the guys that don't, if they're playing against the other team's best lines and they're doing okay, they're treading water, then they're doing their job.
Right.
And your point is well taken about Jordan and how he's progressing, how he's maturing. I mean, in the back of my mind, I have Sean Walker. That's what you hope that Jordan Spence will become. And that's still a big leap because, I think we see now with Sean, the way he's progressed, when he makes contact, he's not the biggest, but you know contact. Jordan probably has to approach things the same way when he's defending, meaning rely on his footwork to get his body in position. If his body is not in position, he's in trouble. To, use his stick, reads, gap control. And I think it all just starts with his skating. But, if we're going to break, he's plus 23 on the year. So if we're going to use those numbers for Edmundson, now, I think you do need to see a little bit more offense when you're that size as a defender. Now, not bad. 4 goals, 28 points, not bad. And then again, on a team that's the second best defensive team. So, the reason they're the second best defensive team is they probably don't take as many chances as other teams do. And that would limit Jordan's ability to produce points. But I think, Jesse, I think you're on to it. And I don't want to say it, but yeah, he's a complimentary player at this point. Sean Walker isn't. Sean Walker's a pretty, an impact player.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, Sean Walker had to play on 3 different teams before he got there.
Yeah, exactly. So it takes that, and then it's the growth within a group. And again, Jordan was one of the, when Jim Hiller was asked in the playoffs, about the usage of players, and he says, we play the players we feel give us the best chance to win every night. And Jordan was not in that category. Now, you can say that was a mistake or go where you want, but that's the way he was viewed by the coaching staff. And like you say, those blue numbers, the blue streaks, the blue categories that came up were, he did everything he could to make them blue. But,
so this is an unfair comparison that I'm going to make, and I only make it because of a role on the team, not physicality, style of game, anything like that. But in the early 2010s, the Kings had Alec Martinez and Matt Green on the third pair, and at the time, those were clearly the third pair defenders. But they excelled at that role. And so when you had these big time matchups in the playoffs or when called upon to make a play or to be present in a moment, you had these 2 players that the organization implicitly trusted and who were better at that role than their counterparts on the other teams. So, the idea that, well, it's only a support role is sort of like, well, yes, but you also need your support guys to be great, right? If you want to be a great team, your support players need to be great at support, I guess is what I'm getting at. So how do you fill in the gaps between acceptable support player and great support player? And you may not know the answer to that. There may not be an answer to that.
Well, again, there's only so much ice time.
Yeah.
So your great support players are still going to only play 15, 16 minutes a night.
Mm-hmm.
They're not going to be 22, 23, 24. It's just that, if they're still in that support role. Again, everyone does have their role. You have to accept your role during the course of a season. But I think in the back of everyone's mind, like in the back of Jordan's mind, I bet you he wants to have a bigger role.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there always is that you get to that edge of the envelope where you start doing too much and you kind of lose the effectiveness that you had, or you start to do more and it works. And then you get to that next level, then you're a second pair. Again, I'm going to go by usage in the playoffs, and the coaching staff felt he was not there yet. And I'm sure they have internal numbers. I'm sure they have numbers that say, okay, matchups we couldn't get, this, so we had to protect them. And every coach has to do that. Every coaching staff has to do that, where they have to find the ways to use their players. And again, we're going to spend as much time on Jordan Spence here as we would on Joel Edmundson, and we'll do on Brandt Clarke. And we've had this conversation many times before, but at this point, Jordan Spence is not an impact player. So, you can, and we all know the discussion on the 13th forward and the 7th defense is probably more than anything else.
Yeah.
In every area, every team, when you get into a market, most of the discussion is 13th forward, 7th defenseman. Jordan's not a 7th defenseman now. He's proved that he's better than that. And, you just got to hope that he can get to that point where next playoffs, he'll play 17 minutes in the regular season and he'll play 16 and a half in the playoffs.
So we're going to move on to Brandt Clarke now. Part of the reason that we're pairing Edmundson, Spence, and Clarke, part of it is just that Doughty missed, most of the season. And so you obviously have to talk about him. We have to devote our time to talking about Drew Doughty. But also part of it is that when Joel Edmundson was brought in, my expectation, and this is just based on what they said to us before the Doughty injury, was that the pairs would be Anderson, Doughty, Gavrikov, Spence, Edmundson, Clarke. And Edmundson would be brought in at least partially to be, not a great phrase, but training wheels for Brandt Clarke or a mentor to Brandt Clarke. And because Joel Edmundson wound up playing more minutes in the wake of the Drew Doughty injury, and because Gavrikov was pressed into first pair duties and had to switch sides, Clarke and Spence wind up being the two bottom minutes earners on defense, even though they both play the right side, and in theory, one is a second pair and one is a third pair. Brandt Clarke, my memory, and maybe this is not accurate, but my memory is that I think he had 33 points on the season.
Yep.
My memory is that most of those points, if not virtually all of them, were earned in the first third or half of the season.
Right.
And then there was a cooling off, or maybe it was just, the defense had to adjust and shuffle. And then once Drew Doughty came back, the coaching staff felt that the top four of Gavrikov, Anderson, Edmundson, and Doughty were the reliable players. But either way, Brandt Clarke's offense, cooled off in the second half of the season. But obviously, 8th overall pick in the draft, and everybody knows about his upside and the potential, and the organization has not been shy about speaking very glowingly about the potential that he has. So how much of a step forward, because that's what we're grading Brandt Clarke on at this point, is how close is he?
Yeah.
Sure, go ahead.
It's, and I know the way you put it, and the way the organization speaks. No, we can see it.
Mm-hmm.
You can see that he can do things that other guys can't.
Yeah.
That's not saying it. That's seeing it.
No, but is he yet the guy who does it every shift? And he's not.
Well, he didn't, and he couldn't.
Yeah.
And he was not allowed to. How's that?
That's great.
But again, Jim Hiller's point on the drop in production was the NHL season.
Mm-hmm.
Early on, teams are starting to still figuring things out. The game's a little bit more wide open. You get to the middle part of the season, teams start to figure out what we got to do to get to the playoffs. Things start to get a little bit tighter. Then you get to the last part of the season, and it's real tight. And there's the production and then the drop-off in production. That was his take on it. And his usage, too. Right? He sat out a game, right? Which is not a huge thing. But I think it sat out at least one game there when he was struggling with offensive points. And there's no question that he adapted his game. Brandt made a change himself.
Mm-hmm.
Fit in with what the coaching staff was asking him to do. There's no question in my mind. And that hurt his offensive production.
Mm-hmm.
But at the end of all of that, it's easy to see that his ceiling is higher than most. Will he need a partner like an Edmundson throughout his entire career? Maybe yes, maybe no. I know when, for instance, you go to Colorado and they have Taves and McCarr together. Taves is not necessarily a defensive stay-at-home guy. So it might change throughout his career, but right now they felt he needed those training wheels, as you put. He needed someone there as a safety valve. But he does have that ceiling. And that's something you're always just, I'm the same way. I'm chomping at the bit. Hey, we got to get him out there more. And you know what? A lot of times, let's face it, the Kings season went pretty well, right? So they were holding leads late in games as opposed to needing goals late in games.
Right.
That's where Brandt would play more and produce more. It's the argument of you put up points for a team that's not in the playoffs, or you put up points for a team that is in the playoffs.
Mm-hmm.
That's a different thing. And, but Brandt, I think from my conversations, I'm his biggest cheerleader because I think he can be a game changer. And under the right circumstances, he'll have another year under his belt, a full year under his belt when he comes to camp next year. He'll have an exact idea of what the coaching staff wants from him, but he also has that skill set that you can't teach. And sooner or later, that has to be used.
The moment, and I've referenced it before, I don't remember the last time I did it. There was a moment in a game against Buffalo, I think it was Buffalo, in November, and Brandt Clarke was at the blue line, or maybe just, I think it was just inside the blue line, and there was a loose puck near the top of the face-off circle, and he could have advanced on the puck. It might have created a 50-50 battle at open ice, but instead he backed off into the neutral zone and allowed the opponent to gather the puck and start breaking out. And that in that moment, that's when I saw, that was a conscious decision on his part to play that more responsible style, right? He didn't try and move forward on a puck that he didn't have possession of. He retreated, for lack of a better word, into the neutral zone to take a better defensive position.
He made that decision so he would get another shift.
Well, yes, sure. But that to me was the moment where I saw, that's not how I would expect Brandt Clarke to play that.
I agree with you 100%. And I noticed it. There was almost like a switch, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's probably a lot of conversations. The points are coming early. Then they stopped coming, whether it was the league making adjustments. But obviously they wanted him to make an adjustment in his thinking. He made that adjustment, and it was almost like a flick of a switch. You're right. You could notice it from one game to the next, all of a sudden. And then there was that 50 games where he played that way. But then you saw in the playoffs, right, where, he didn't get the same amount of ice time, nowhere near, but he had an impact, right? I mean, his ice time dropped about 5 minutes a game, but he scored 2 goals. I mean, it's not 6 games played, but just that ability to to be there and be able to finish and be able to create, even in a playoff. That's something that's you got to look forward to. I mean, it's something that's going to be positive to look forward to.
It's funny. I was talking to somebody about the 2016 playoffs, and I was saying, that was the season where they had set the record for the most wins in franchise history. And I was saying, I can remember Jake Muzzin scoring the first goal in game 1 at home in the playoffs. And then I caught myself and I was like, was it Jake Muzzin? And I was like, yeah, I can remember. He was right out front. I remember sitting in the press box. I remember turning to the person next to me and hitting them in the arm and going like, okay, here we go. Brandt Clarke's goal in game 2 is this. I don't know why I'm always going to remember it, but I'm gonna. There's not going to be any rhyme or reason. 10 years from now, I'll be having this conversation with somebody and I'll say, yeah, remember that? Remember game 2.
When you bring up Jake Muzzin's name, it's all because I had a conversation with Dean Marty one time. And it was the first time, because, Jake was hard to put a number on, a value on. And I went to Dean after the game. I said, Dean, I know you guys are tracking a whole bunch of things, but did you just track like touches and the outcome of that touch? Every time the player touches it, does he accomplish what he wanted to accomplish with that touch? Mm-hmm. Sometimes it could be off the glass and out. Sometimes it could be eat the puck and hold on to it and wait for help. Sometimes it could be a tap. And Jake had a game and it was like, Dean, I said to him, every time he touched the puck, I think he did what he was trying to do, what he wanted to accomplish. And, he said, yeah, you're right. We track all that. And that's where Brandt is trying to get to. He's just trying to make sure that he is getting it done. And also within the structure of how his teammates can read what he wants to get done and not put everyone in a bad situation. And I think he did a pretty good job of that. Again, we know every team probably has this type of player where, you tighten the reins on them, but you also know there will be a time when you can loosen those reins and it's only going to be a positive.
It's a funny thing. We talked to Mike Buckley about Darcy Kemper. And, I said, like, obviously he had an incredible season. He's a Vezina finalist. So it's going to be pretty difficult to one of the questions I had was like, what more could the Kings goaltending have given them this season? And it's like, well, obviously not much. They finished, what was it, the 6th best record in the NHL, tied for best points in franchise history, second in the division. Like, and it's the same thing with the defense. You know, you mentioned it. What are they, second best in goals against on the entire season? So it's pretty hard, at least if we're evaluating the regular season, it's pretty hard to find red flags or to poke holes in anything, which is, I suppose, why it's so disappointing that the playoffs went the way they did. But I thought
it makes this conversation difficult because we know the way it all ended.
Yeah.
But again, that baby with the bathwater is something we got to keep an eye on. And, you know, do you throw it? Yeah, but they're also, I know it wasn't too long ago. I mean, we're sitting here on May 21st, and, you know, someone wrote up, you know, after the first two rounds, the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, like the top, we're out.
Yeah.
You kind of, or, you know, that's where you, and again, only 8 teams are left at that point, but that's where, you know, we'll try to, as a group, they'll try to figure out just exactly what is needed. I mean, you know, the biggest turnaround was the power play, right?
Yeah,
from a negative, not only because of the lack of production, but just certain moments in games when the Kings and then they end up with 105 points. So, but then in the playoffs, so
I've discovered a new kind of I've discovered a new kind of trivia or stat, and they are things that don't matter but are true, and it just bugs me endlessly, because you look at it and you go, like, there's no reason this should matter, and yet it's true. And the point about
it's where I'm sitting now. If I'm asked to give player grades or evaluate players, I'm taking into account mostly the 82 games with a little hindsight onto the playoffs there. But and that's where it's again, it's hard to have this discussion because, and it is hard, right? It is hard to not throw out the baby with the bathwater. It is hard. I mean, it's hard. You could just, they should scrap everything. You know, look what happened, 4th year in a row. And I understand that sentiment. I mean, I was just personally, I was devastated after Game 4. And I know that they're professionals. I know that they have sports psychologists to help them. But in reality, I also felt that to come back after that, after Games 3 and Games 4, was and that we saw it in Game 5.
Yeah.
We were able to have a bounce back in Game 6, you know, enough to be, you know, back into that category of had a chance. You know, you scored a goal with a goalie pulled, and you're within one. You know, you're hoping, but that's where, you know, that's still eating at me right now. And, you know, obviously, you know, what doesn't kill you hopefully makes you stronger. And that's where you got to approach that for next year. And, you know, completely big. The one thing just about, when I'm talking about playoffs and we're supposed to be evaluating players, I felt it. And I went in, I talked to people in Edmonton. I you know what? You can't underestimate the value of going to the 7th game of the Stanley Cup final. They had a new group of players, right? They had some, you know, a lot of people felt they weren't as deep and all that, but they went through it. And it's hard to get there. And by getting there, that core group knew how to get there again. And I think that's what the Kings have players that have won it, but it's been a while and the core group is probably different.
And now it's up to Dallas to save my sanity. I don't know about everybody else's, but Jim, thank you for joining me today.
You're a Stars fan now?
Well, now I mean, listen, I've been terrified of them for the last however many years it's been, and
the roster's pretty good.
Yeah, maybe it's their year to finally step up and figure it out. But we're going to do this as the summer goes on. But that's it for today. Jim, thank you as always for joining me.
Thanks, Jesse.
And I will talk to you soon.